IVM.
In 1992, George Stanham published an infamous essay titled Indian Strategic Thought, an Interpretive Essay for the Rand Corporation in the United States. The essay outlines how India has few writings that offer coherent, articulated beliefs or a clear set of operating principles for Indian strategy. Going all the way back to the Hindu conceptualizations of time and the lack of sense of time, Stanham says that this discourages planning and does not result in a strong culture of strategic thinking in India. Even today, many people believe both in India and abroad that India, its leaders, its culture and its polity are not strategic. Dhruva Jaishankar joins me on this episode of the Pragati Podcast to dispel this myth and talk about how Indian strategic thought and culture really work. Welcome to the Pragati Podcast, a weekly talk show on public policy, economics, and international relations. I'm your host, Pavan Srinath. Dhruva Jaishankar is Fellow in Foreign Policy Studies both at Brookings India in New Delhi and at Brookings in Washington, D.C. He works on India's role in the international system and the effects of global developments on India, with a special focus on India's relationships with the United States, Europe, and the Indo-Pacific. Dhruva and I talk about how India does have a strategic culture, even if it doesn't have Western trappings. We explore India's national security apparatus as it exists today, and we explore what factors will drive India's grand strategy in the years and decades to come. Before we start the discussion with Dhruva, a couple of messages. Do you like the Pragati Podcast? Tell a friend and give us a shout out on social media. And if you have a longer question or suggestion, write in to podcast@thinkpragati.com. And you listen to us on iTunes or Apple Podcasts, then please leave us a rating and a review. It will mean a lot to us. The Pragati Podcast will return with Dhruva Jaishankar after this short break.
Hey everybody, welcome to another awesome week on IVM Podcast. If you're not following us on social media, please make sure you do. We are IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. So we have a listener survey going on right now. It's going to run till the end of March. It's on our website. It's ivmpodcast.com/survey. Please do participate on that listener survey. Give us your feedback. Tell us a little bit about yourself. That helps us when we go out and talk to advertisers. It is also very helpful for us to kind of know who you are and what kind of things you like. We ask a lot of questions around what kind of content you'd like to see us put out in the next couple of months. And we'd really appreciate any feedback that you could give us. We launched a new podcast on Valentine's Day called Dating is Garbage. Surbi, Abbas, and Janam talk modern dating and the woes and wows that come with it. Each week they sit down with some very cool guests and have an unfiltered conversation about their dating habits, awkward experiences, and heartbreaks. Tune in to hear them attempting therapy on each other. On the first episode, we have comedian Uruj Ashfaq discussing rejection. On Cyrus Says, Cyrus is joined by lawyer couple YP and Abha Singh. They discuss what it takes to stand up to authority in court, corruption in India, and how the Me Too movement has affected court cases. Also, check out the hilarious Valentine's Day special of Cyrus Says, where he was joined by Aisha, his wife, Kunal Vijayakar, and me. The four of us try to discuss and dissect romance really, really badly. On Simplified, the trio is joined by Meghnad and Shreyas Manohar. They discuss why learning school civics can help us understand today's political scenario and about their new podcast, How to Citizen. On The Habit Coach, Ashton talks about the importance of substituting your regular table salt with Himalayan pink salt. On Croc's Tales, we have a month-long Valentine's special. Anand takes up classic fairy tales and gives them a modern Croc's Tales spin. And with that, let's continue with your show.
Welcome back. Hi Dhruva, welcome to the Pragati Podcast. Dhruva, I want to start off by asking this question. I think in 1992 or so, George Stanham wrote this famous essay saying that India does not have a strategic culture. And you see some version of that argument being repeated year after year after year, that, our politicians don't care about our national security and foreign policy. Our armed forces are off doing their own thing. Our foreign policy services do their own thing. And India does not think about grand strategy. And if we don't think about grand strategy, we will never become a great power or a global power. So what is this strategic culture? And then let's talk about whether we have it or not.
Sure. Well, thank you for having me. George Stanham wrote this essay in 92. It was called Indian Strategic Thought, an Interpretive Essay. He was a scholar at the Rand Corporation in California. And it does seem to have had a very long shelf life. You still hear people citing it and quoting it. I think you point to some of the very significant and very real issues that India faces in terms of integration and articulation of a strategy. But I've had a lot of problems with the fact that Tanham continues to be quoted and cited. And the biggest problem I think it has is it falls prey to a very elementary social science mistake, which is the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. So because he could not see any evidence of it, that he assumed it doesn't exist. And I think that's a common mistake that is made. India doesn't have a single strategic document that it can cite, and that's for a variety of reasons, mostly political reasons. But I don't think that should indicate that India, at this moment or in the past, has not had some level of strategic thinking, and in fact, sometimes quite sophisticated strategic thinking. So, one way is to look back, and I think if you look back in Indian history, I think there is a long tradition starting with Ashoka, and there's a book called the Niti Sara that came out under the Gupta Empire, from the Mahabharata, the Babur Nama. I mean, so you have this long tradition in ancient and medieval India. I think if you look, more recently, whether during the colonial period, whether it was Indians or it was Brits in India, were thinking in strategic ways about their periphery, about their neighborhood, about their interactions with the rest of the world. And you see this again in everyone from Gandhi and Nehru and Ambedkar to again Curzon and Caro and British colonial leaders. And then if you look at post-independence, I think there's there's a lot of writing by everyone from Nehru down on sort of India's place in the world. The actions also bear it out. It's not simply words. I think the fact that post-independence India has remained unified, has on occasion won wars, has proliferated its, in terms of its partnerships and its positive relationships with many parts of the world, has by and large, again, not without a great deal of difficulty, preserved a peaceful periphery. I think if you look at all of this, I think it's very hard to make that argument seriously that there's been a complete absence of strategic culture. So where does this come from? I think a few areas. One, again, is the lack of written documents. Sometimes people don't have access to or haven't looked, or it is in a language that they don't understand. So that is often the case. A lot is oral. A lot, unfortunately, has been destroyed. I mean, the fact, again, the most famous treatise on strategy, that is Kautilya, was lost for so many years, the full text of which it was lost.
Yeah, it was only discovered in the 20th
century. So, there has been very poor record keeping. I was looking into this issue with, looking into Indian maps and Indian maps that were not, pre-colonial Indian maps. And there's surprisingly few that have survived. And this doesn't mean that there was a complete absence of map making. There's some evidence to suggest that there was some map making and cartographic skills that were developed in India. But a lot of documents have unfortunately been destroyed. And I think the lack of emphasis on preserving archival material continues to haunt India. And then I think furthermore, a lot of things, the former Foreign Secretary Shyam Saran has written about this, particularly in contrast to China, which is that India has much more of an oral tradition. And so a lot of things are implicitly understood in India without it being put down on paper and with paper and pen. So I think these are all reasons why there's this continuing belief that there's an absence of strategic culture. Again, that doesn't mean that everything goes well or that all decisions have been made properly or have been well thought through. But I think there's overwhelmingly many cases to disprove that point.
So if we take a couple of steps back, within this context of a nation state, what is strategy? Mm-hmm. How do we look at that? I mean, because there's corporate strategy, and the word can be used endlessly, right? So, but what would you mean when you look at this?
So, I have written about this too. I mean, strategy is a very broad word, but it basically is about achieving certain set goals with a set of constrained resources in a certain manner, and within a certain context. And I think that last part is often forgotten about, that a strategy can be quite different even if all the other elements are the same, if the context is very different. So that applies equally to corporate strategy, to anything else. When it's used in international relations, it's basically shorthand for grand strategy, right? Which is how a nation or a nation state, particularly the leadership of that nation state, defines its overall objectives, uses its means, its resources available to it in a certain way and in a certain context, a certain international environment. So that, I think, is very simply what we mean by by a grand strategy. In many countries, there is a process now of setting out a grand strategy in a document, and that document becoming the template that people further down the chain use. So in the US is a classic example. The White House puts out a national security strategy document. This then is used to inform a national defense strategy. This then is used to inform various diplomatic. It informs the nuclear strategy and so forth. In India, again, we don't quite have that. That being said, again, just in recent years, there have been a few significant speeches which I understand are already used by the military and by others. These are speeches given by political leaders that are already used as a kind of template for policy. So again, while we don't have a formal strategic document, I think there are elements that we can tie together and derive what an Indian national security strategy does look like.
So from this idea of a strategy, right, and a grand national strategy, what would a strategic culture be? Would that mean you have people and institutions who are actively thinking about this strategy and trying to execute it? What does that entail? And I mean, Tanham clearly comes to India from the West and has looked at what he calls strategic culture in the West and finds that form of it is missing, right? Yes. So what was he imagining in his mind? What would happen?
Well, I think he was imposing, say, a US template on India. And again, I think we forget also that the US, a lot of the institutions that we now take for granted, really came up during and immediately after World War II. Right. That until that point, if you look at European commentaries of the U.S. in around World War I or after World War I, it's actually very similar to the commentaries you see about India today, which is here's this rising power. Clearly, it has a future. Clearly, it has economic dynamism. It has all the other ingredients, and yet, it is isolated. It doesn't know how to wield its power. It is temperamental. It is, it sounds a lot like the commentary. So, again, we take for granted, I think, the fact we sort of assume that every country sort of is born, with these instruments and these elements and culture of a strategy, but a lot of it has to be learnt and acquired over time. And I think we have seen that steady evolution in India after independence. That is what was true in the 1950s and 60s, clearly often in response to the failures of 1962. A lot of that changed over the course of the 70s. Then again, we saw another wave in the 90s and all that. If you look at what some of the elements of strategic culture are today, you have processes. I think people forget about, you do have policy processes, even if many things are still subject to the whims of individuals in India, and again more so than perhaps the US or many other places. But that being said, you do have processes, and those can't be shortcut as easily. And particularly this seems to confuse and frustrate people, even from Pakistan and so, where I don't think you have these the institutions are as strong. You have again. Now a healthy, I think there's still a lot more that could be done, of course, a culture of think tanks outside, people who spend their time thinking about these issues. We have a robust debate in the media about strategic issues, and we have now for 20 years, and if not earlier. So again, I think you have these elements of a strategic culture. You have a healthy debate in India. By one count, this year's survey came out. India has now more think tanks than any country other than the US. It's the second most number of think tanks in the world. So clearly, that there's room for improvement, also in terms of the quality. But I think that is indicative of this growing strategic culture that is taking hold.
So in the American style, so like you said, there's a grand national security document, which then devolves into other documents, and then people make plans accordingly, right? So say you're making a 5-year budget plan, you're going to use elements from this document to do it. What are the explicit documents that exist in India now? You also mentioned a few speeches which are being used. Could you give me a sense of what people are using nowadays, be it the armed forces, our intelligence services, or anyone else?
Right. No, I would say one, and this is an aberration, but one, I think, very good example is the nuclear doctrine. Which was drafted often. This was in response to a very specific circumstance, which is there was pressure on India after the nuclear tests to, I think the leadership at the time, the Vajpayee government, saw that there was a need for India to show itself as a responsible nuclear power. And part of that, in this very unusual exercise, was this articulating a nuclear doctrine. And there they used a vehicle, the National Security Advisory Board. And they had, at the time, 30 plus members from all. You had people from the Army, Air Force, Navy, retired, from the scientific establishment. It was quite a comprehensive group of people, and they put out a short draft nuclear strategy in 1999, about a year after the nuclear tests. This was followed in 2003 with the actual nuclear doctrine, of which only a small excerpt was released in public, but which is classified, but is believed to be based on the draft nuclear doctrine. And that still remains, I think, the cornerstone of India's nuclear strategy. Now, this was, again, done under particular circumstances. You don't see that necessarily replicated in the same way in other domains. And particularly the military, for example, doctrine comes out of each of the services, which means they're often not in concurrence with each other. They're not necessarily sanctioned by the defense ministry, the civilian leadership, let alone the political leadership.
But there's supposed to be a Raksha Mantri directive of some sort.
There are directives and all that. So, you do also have, it's quite clear what falls thanks to the Constitution, and then other policies that have come, what falls under the state, what falls under the center. That's become more and more clear. What falls under the PMO versus what falls under different ministries, where Parliament, how much oversight Parliament has. So these are issues where I think they've been negotiated over time, but I think there's greater clarity about. I'm not saying the situation necessarily optimal, but we do have some sense about where different actors can play a role and where there are checks and balances. I'll give you a few examples of some speeches recently, which have been indicative. I would say a few, two earlier ones in this government and one more recent. One was in 2015, Prime Minister Modi did a speech in Mauritius on the Indian Ocean strategy, where the Sagar concept was first articulated. So that, I think, was the clearest articulation of an Indian Ocean strategy for India. And if you read it now, many of those elements are works in progress, but there are attempts being made to implement that.
So what would this idea be in brief?
Well, no, I mean, it includes sort of infrastructure building, basically institution building, that it would be in India desires as of inclusive, as long as the security competition is not, the security situation is not undermined by extra regional actors. So, all of that, I think, if you both explicitly and in some cases implicitly are spelled out in that speech. In 2017, in January, he gave a similar speech at the Raisina Dialogue, which was, I think, the closest thing you've seen to an articulation of worldview. Now, again, this being one prime minister, if you have a change in government, that may change with him. But I think you do have a broad articulation of what the priorities are. So in that speech, for example, he spoke at great length about 3 bilateral relationships, which were the US, Russia, and Japan. And I think that's a pretty good indication of, if you're looking at India's global partnerships today, those are probably the 3 most important ones. I think the closest, would be the speech given at the Shangri-La Dialogue last year in Singapore. This was in June 2018, where the Prime Minister basically articulated India's Indo-Pacific policy and what that meant. And I know, for example, people in the Navy now have used that. That has led them to do many of the things they wanted to do anyway. But they now, with that speech, they now feel that they have a clear direction from the top. So again, in the absence of a national security strategy, these kinds of speeches, because they have a certain deniability, I think this is why it has ended up being this way. But
because there's a cost to having an explicit written out, say, a white paper on India's national security and so on, right? There are costs involved.
To it, I mean, including political costs, right? Which is, it would become a punching bag for parliamentary debates and all of that. Now, I think there are ways around it. One, you can make it a much more inclusive document, and it'll require many years of consultations and things like that. If you wanted to do this exercise properly. There is, I believe, it has been reported that the National Security Advisory Board today is sanctioned to do something like this, although I don't think they may do it in time before the next elections. So, I do think it is possible. I also don't think it is necessarily the end of the world if India does not have an explicit strategy. I know I'm quite more familiar with the Australian context as well, they put out regular white papers. And the last one that came out wasn't as controversial as it could have been, but there certainly was some rather heated criticism of elements of the foreign policy white paper that they issued.
So here, I think sometimes people think that there's this idea every time that, armed forces are typically preparing to fight the last war.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So even now, I think if you read op-eds on defense and so on, once in a while this idea of a two-front war that you have to fight for so many number of days, and the Indian armed forces need to be prepared for that. Right? So if you read from there, it means that India's strategy is to have a armed forces apparatus in order to prevent that. Whereas we are now in the 21st century, we have nuclear weapons. These two fronts we are talking about, both those countries have nuclear weapons. So the game is completely different, right? So, ideas like these lend themselves very easily to criticism where we say, oh, there is no strategy. We have not evolved beyond having nuclear weapons,
right.
And, use those ideas to change our strategy in various ways. So is that legitimate? How do you think there are more complex conversations happening, say, behind closed doors?
No, I think there are always more complex conversations happening, but that doesn't mean that there aren't elements of truth to that line of criticism. And I don't think this is unique to the Indian Army. I mean, I think most militaries are preparing to fight was based on past experience, and they learn from each experience. So, again, I think the Indian armed services are heavily informed by the experiences in Kargil and Parakram in 2002, and have had to make some changes accordingly. But that's still now 16 years away. Keeping up with the pace of technological change is going to be a major challenge, which is we're entering into a phase where there'll be a few breakthrough technologies that will come on at some point of time. This includes, artificial intelligence, and particularly what that will mean for decision-making and speed of decision-making, for unmanned warfare, and whether that will actually incentivize offensive behavior. After many years, particularly in the nuclear era, we've become accustomed to defensive superiority, but now there'll be incentives if you can launch an unmanned attack for offensive behavior. You could see, I think that's the second, hypersonic missiles, I think, are changing the game when it comes to missile defense, and those would be the sort of three kind of major changes that we're seeing. I mean, also on the energy front, I think, as well, which is a non-fossil fuel energy. So these will actually, at some point of time, it could be 20 years. It's not going to happen soon necessarily, but these are on the horizon already, and there's already a lot of R&D going into these areas. So these will fundamentally change the way we think about warfighting. And the problem is, even if we do revise doctrines today, they could be out of place very soon.
So it's more like a Wikipedia entry that you have to keep updating.
It is. Actually, that's a good example. It's more like a Wikipedia entry that will need to be constantly updated. But there is, I think, a particular challenge to India, which is the lack of jointness, the fact that staff and command functions are combined in the services, which most large militaries have moved away from, including the Chinese PLA. These actually making it very difficult for India to, particularly on the defense side, to articulate and implement sort of cohesive strategies.
Yeah, right. But like you said, these are challenges faced by everyone, right? Whether or not they have a grand strategy.
Yes,
For example, in the United States, I think there are still many things from submarines to aircrafts and other things that are being built because they're providing jobs in a certain constituency rather than because they necessarily are required today.
Or I'll give you another example. I won't name the country, but a country in East Asia is now, a small country in East Asia is set to acquire some major battle tanks, which everybody, including in their own military, understands that in no scenario would they actually be deploying these main battle tanks. But it's done basically to improve morale. Because they're having falling. We have a big tank, and they're actually having falling recruitment numbers in their military. So they're literally acquiring a large number of main battle tanks only to boost morale, not because it has any.
So recruitment and marketing expenditure.
Yeah, exactly. So again, everyone is dysfunctional in their own ways. India has its own challenges, and I do think there are some very serious challenges that are unique to India that we'll have to confront very soon.
We'll be back with Dhruva Jaishankar after this short break.
Hi listeners, we at Aditya Birla Sun Life Mutual Fund have come up with a special podcast series called MF 101 in collaboration with Bloomberg Quint. MF 101 is an informative series that will help you understand the recipe behind mutual fund investments. And what's more, it's coming from the chefs of the mutual fund buffet table, from the very own fund managers and analysts who are the manufacturers of the funds that help you realize your investment goals. New episodes out every Monday. You can listen to the show on the IVM Podcast app or wherever you get your podcasts.
Welcome back. Dhruva, could you tell us a little about the institutions that we have now that form a part of this strategic thinking, right? So we have the National Security Advisor, we have the National Security Advisory Board. I think there is an NSCS. Is that the National Security
Council Secretariat?
Council Secretariat. Okay. So what are all of these, and how do they work?
So, ultimately responsibility rests with the Prime Minister and the Prime Minister's office, he or she and their staff. And the institution, the National Security Advisor, came up again after India's nuclear tests. It was deemed that there was a need for such a position and is kind of the key security and foreign policy advisor to the Prime Minister.
Was Brajesh Mishra the first?
Brajesh Mishra was the first, and he was also the principal secretary, so he was dual-hatted in that way, but we've had 5 since the current one is the 5th. There is a National Security Council Secretariat, NSCS, that provides support for the National Security Council. The National Security Council itself is a cabinet-level council that meets periodically to approve key decisions, and can, in a few cases, it's been recorded, has voted on 5 members of the council have voted on some key issues, including overruling the Prime Minister on a few issues.
So the NSC would be a set of cabinet members, including the NSA? No,
it's usually, traditionally it's been the Prime Minister, Foreign, Defense, Finance, and Home Ministers.
Okay.
Those 5. Their meetings can be attended by a number of people. So the National Security Advisor is the key advisor to this council. But again, this is all in theory. But it can be also the service chiefs, Army, Air Force, Navy attend meetings. The intelligence chiefs attend these meetings, several senior bureaucrats and the like. So this is for key political decisions of strategic significance. So I'll give you 2 examples that have been documented. One goes back to the 1970s and this concerned a decision to restart India's nuclear weapons program. This was after intelligence was received that basically Pakistan had made some significant advancements after the return of A.Q. Khan to Pakistan. A second such decision involved sending troops to Iraq in 2003. This was peacekeeping troops after the U.S. invasion. And in the summer of that year, there was a very serious discussion and deliberation on that. So on those 2 issues, it's been documented now that there was a decision involving the 5 leading cabinet officials. So, that again is how it works in theory.
So that's the NSC, and then there's a secretariat
to
support them.
But the secretariat is relatively small. It also includes the Joint Intelligence Committee, so the JIC, which is the meant to be the clearinghouse for all intelligence inputs as well. So the National Security Advisory Board is a sort of semi-official body, composed primarily of outsiders. So in the past, it's included retired officials, journalists, academic experts, and so forth. It has varied in size. The first one was over 30. Most importantly, it was drafting the nuclear doctrine. The recent past, it went down to as little as 4 and 5. It's just been expanded, I believe, to about 10. Okay. And its role has, sometimes they do open source research. So it is a sort of semi-official body. It doesn't have any executive authority, but can provide inputs to the National Security Advisor and to the Prime Minister. Below that, again, you have key ministries that deal with it. Of course, Defense Ministry, Ministry of External Affairs, Home Ministry, and each of them is led by ministers of state and a secretary. So that, I think, is the execution arm in some ways of these things, although information can also filter up to the cabinet level. In India, quite unusually, the parliament has relatively little oversight over external affairs and defense. You do have parliamentary standing committees for external affairs and defense. They do put out reports, they do hold hearings, but relative to many other places, including the UK or the US, there's not as much legislative oversight as there is in those countries. So that, I think, is the larger apparatus. Of course, states can play a role in certain ways, although, again, according to the Constitution, external affairs is a matter for the central government. But we're now seeing, whether it's commercial diplomacy, whether it's issues like resource sharing, whether it's fisheries, Tamil Nadu, and disputes between Tamil Nadu and Sri Lanka, or water sharing between West Bengal and Bangladesh, you do see now states playing some kind of role also in foreign affairs. But this is, I think, the large apparatus that we have.
And in this, could you also tell me a little about how active prime ministers have necessarily been? Mm-hmm. We've seen this from the times of Nehru, right? Mm-hmm. That though we've had specific foreign ministers, the prime ministers have continued to play a strong role when it comes to foreign policy and strategic affairs. Mm-hmm. Is this common in India through the 60, 70 years? Is it common across the world?
So I do think you have had, as much out of necessity as by accident, you've had a series of prime ministers who've had a particular interest in foreign affairs. So starting with Nehru, continuing under Indira Gandhi, Shastri was of course short-lived, Rajiv Gandhi as well. In many cases, they often held either the foreign or defense ministry portfolio as well.
So you didn't even have a foreign minister.
There were periods of time, Indira Gandhi and Rajiv Gandhi held the defense portfolio for many years. Nehru held the foreign ministry portfolio for many years. And then you had a series, both Narasimha Rao and Vajpayee had been foreign ministers before becoming prime minister. So interestingly enough, they both came in with a little bit of experience on that front. And then both Manmohan Singh and Modi have also shown quite a strong interest in foreign affairs. Now, again, some of this is out of necessity. Whether you like it or not, anyone who is the prime minister has to today attend 6-7 major summits a year. So even if they had zero interest in foreign affairs, they're forced into this position. I think there's also been a change. I think there's a realization now, thanks to the diaspora. I think we forget how much the rest of the world matters to India. India is the largest arms importer over the last 5 years, more than any other country. It is the third largest energy importer after the US and China. And I think relative to its energy needs is perhaps one of maybe after Japan, it's the largest energy importer. It has the largest diaspora of any country. It has the second largest number of overseas students. If you take all of this together, India is actually much more dependent on the rest of the world than one would imagine.
And vice versa, right? The rest of the world is also dependent on India and Indians in one way or the other.
Yeah, and that is growing too. So I think that interchange is very interesting. India is already the second largest export destination for Afghan exports. So the Afghan economy is becoming increasingly dependent on India. That will have some role to play whatever happens in the situation there.
Even in the United States, if you look at pretty much any state, the largest number of immigrants would be from Mexico. Yes. The number 2 country would likely be India.
It's usually China or India now, and the Chinese perhaps decreasing. China, India, Philippines, but India, in many places, India is now the second largest destination. So, again, if you look at all of these things, it is two-way. But increasingly, even from a very selfish, self-interested point of view, the idea that you can ignore the goings on in the rest of the world, I think, is not very realistic, given all of these requirements that I mentioned.
Dhruva, we've been talking about the grand strategy idea. For India, especially independent India, right? So there's this, I remember one old essay, was it by K.M. Panikar or someone, saying that, we have this subcontinental mentality. We are Jambu Dvipa, we are Bharatavarsha. There's so many problems at home, so we don't look out very much. But do you think that was an important obsession for strategy as well? India was the very artificial country in the eyes of most people in the world, right? This was cobbling together of British territories and princely states and so on. So wasn't our grand strategy for the longest time just to keep India together? Mm-hmm. How would you look at that evolution just post-independence?
Sure. No, I think there's been remarkable consistency after independence in what India's grand strategic objectives are, and it's there and clear in the preamble of the Constitution, which is the grand strategy of India is to have a secure, prosperous, and democratic India. again, that the meaning of that has changed over time. What prosperity meant in 1947 is not necessarily, we can aspire to greater things in today's world. But I think that broad objective that a secured, prosperous, democratic India has been the objective of all governments since. I think the security side is actually in some ways interesting because we forget how insecure India was on independence. So as much as 25% of the territory that is currently administered by India has at some point been subject to separatism or claims by another country. This extends to all of J&K, Arunachal Pradesh. We've had insurgencies in Mizoram and Punjab. Goa was not part of India at independence. Neither was Pondicherry. The Andaman Nicobar Islands was disputed at the beginning. So a very good chunk.
The Nizam was not very happy with
Hyderabad, Junagadh. I mean, so you have actually, 25% of what is today India could not have been India at some point. And so I think a lot of credit is due to a number of leaders, particularly in the first 20 years, in ensuring that was the case. Now, again, it doesn't mean everything was perfect and all of that, but I think we underestimate the degree of to which India was deeply insecure. Now that those battles have largely been won, I think you can focus on some of the other elements of it, which is making India a more prosperous and democratic polity. And that, I think, remains in some ways the biggest challenge facing us today.
Right. So the idea of, and security even in economic and other terms, right?
Yes.
So the idea of economic growth, jobs, and so on.
Food security was a big, until the mid-60s, India was heavily dependent on food aid, not just food imports, just food aid from the rest of the world. So again, you had this paradox that 1957, India could produce a jet engine, and yet it couldn't feed the vast majority of its people. And again, we've now moved well beyond that as well.
So from there, the other challenge I see, especially sitting here in Bangalore, when a lot of these strategic discussions happen, they typically seem to gravitate around, or at least the mental image of strategic discussions seem to gravitate around, nuclear weapons, defense deals, government-to-government interactions, and so on. Yeah. But strategy and grand strategy is about far more than that, right? Like, for example, in the US-India relationship, isn't the people-to-people connection and the movement of people, ideas, and money perhaps far more important than whether we buy the F-16 or the F-35 or anything else?
No, I think it's absolutely true. I mean, I would say the first priority for Indian foreign policy today is actually improving ways for India to develop domestically. And I mean this in a holistic way. We focus on, the defense and nuclear and side of things. But what I try and do, and I do a lot of talks to people outside of Delhi, is actually give examples that resonate with them significantly. And, whether it is the ability to work abroad or send remittances back, whether it is the safety and security of Indian citizens working on. Many people have family, whether it's in the Gulf or Southeast Asia or in the West. But also issues like addressing overseas tax havens. A simple measure like that, and this is a diplomatic negotiation, could actually increase the revenue base for India significantly. Right. Something like protecting sort of Indian norms on intellectual property will have enormous implications for the pharmaceutical sector, right, which employs lots of people.
So not just in India, but also for Médecins Sans Frontières, which is doing work across the world.
For AIDS
right?
in Africa, I think that's again, India hasn't received the credit I think it deserves for something like that, which is today AIDS at a global level. AIDS is not as urgent a crisis as it was a few years ago, in large part because of generic drug production in India. And had India gone along with the IP laws that the West was pushing at that time, that may not have been the case. So again, there are these things that they're often a little less tangible, more indirect, but I think they have much more significance for people's day-to-day lives. Petrol prices going up and down have enormous implications for the rupee and for inflation and all of that. So these are the kinds of things I think that and I think the reality is that day to day, most diplomats are dealing with these kinds of issues. It's actually not. This doesn't get as much attention in the press and is not discussed. But this, I think, is increasingly the reality of Indian foreign policy. policy. I'll give you one example. I mean, several years ago, and this is actually coming up again because it's up for renewal, the U.S. is threatening to drop what's called GSP plus status for certain exports from India to the U.S., right? So it's basically a lower tariff because India is a lower income country. And the argument is now India has moved into a higher bracket. Why should we still continue this? Now, 10 years ago, 12 years ago, this was actually being contemplated. At the time, they decided to continue it, but it has tremendous implications for the gems and jewelry sector in India, which actually employs 2 million people. And the US is one of the largest export destinations, and Europe is another big export destination. In terms of value, it's actually a very large percentage of India's exports. So, it's something quite minor. It's a technical issue, but will have very serious implications for average Indians. And I think that these are the issues. Unfortunately, you don't see as much press coverage of this, but I think these are the kinds of things that matter much more.
We had a guest on the show a few months ago who basically exported shrimp. And he was also telling about sort of his industry and the India-US relationship there, where I think the Gulf of Mexico shrimp companies got a lot of money and had a lot of clout in Washington, and therefore were able to, put all kinds of, non-tariff barriers and tariff barriers on shrimp exports from India. And it was a profoundly interesting, complex political story that involved companies and company associations from across the world, the two governments and more, right? So you're absolutely right. So we have to move away from just, even our public imagination has to move away from these ideas, and it has to go into trade, it has to go into each industry. And
I'll give you a good example, I think, and this will resonate particularly in Bangalore, which is, how did the Indian software industry take off? It's actually a curious set of three things that came together. One was the fact that India happened to have a large number of trained engineers who spoke English. And the IITs had been set up much, decades before. That was just an existing reality. The second was that there were a few policy changes that were made in the late 80s and early 90s that were done to basically create a single window clearance for the tech sector. And heavily subsidized, for example, high-speed internet connectivity, provided land, reduced the tariffs on hardware, on electronics hardware. And this was done actually in response to the fact that TI tried to set up a plant in Bangalore, Texas Instruments, and it was very frustrating for them. This was in the late 80s.
Yeah, 1988, well before liberalization.
Correct. And so as a result, the government actually took on some of their suggestions and tried to create a single window clearance. And then a third thing happened, which was Y2K. So suddenly there was this global demand for low-cost English-speaking engineers who India happened to have in supply and had the nascent infrastructure in place. And so these things came together to actually create this software boom that India still rides the coattails of. Now, there wasn't any necessarily grand strategy behind any of this. It was some long-term thinking, some opportunism, and then a few smart policy changes. And that all came together in these circumstances to create. I'll give you two or three other very quick examples of how foreign policy actually affects the day-to-day lives of people. Take metros. Now it's a common feature of every sizable Indian city. Even Meerut and Agra setting up metro. Lucknow have metro stations. But it wasn't an accident that the Delhi metro came up in the way it did. And it required a number of things. It required Japanese financing. It required German communications equipment. The rolling stock came from Korea, from Canada. The training of people initially happened in Hong Kong. And so it was actually all of these ingredients that came together, and it required, again, the political circumstances to be right for the Delhi metro to take off. And then that had a replicating effect in many different places. Now it is a common feature in many cities.
And now we have rolling stock manufacturing being set up near Chennai and more.
Gujarat, we have now. So it took some time, but again, it wasn't a pure accident that this happened, and it required a set of political circumstances also. Another good example is public health. That is, India is ahead on public health indicators relative to its income. So India's income is roughly the same as the advanced Western countries in the turn of the 20th century, their average incomes. Most of its health indicators are roughly on par with the West in the 60s and 70s. So it's 60, 70 years ahead. Now, it's for a number of reasons. A lot of it has to do with scientific developments, immunization programs and all of that. But it helps to have channels that can accelerate the spread of that knowledge and diffuse it to local populations. And there again, both state and non-state actors abroad, providing the incentives for them to come to India and work in India has actually played a significant role in bridging that gap. So I think these are just some, I give these because there's some concrete examples of ways we don't necessarily think about, but where foreign policy has affected day-to-day lives of people.
So here it's foreign policy from trade to aid to movement of people to all of those things, and then whatever government-to-government deals that happen, right? With equipment purchases, arms sales,
and the government is
so
often
on.
behind the curve on these things as well. So
Fair enough. So if this is where we are at, these are the kinds of challenges we're looking at, what are the concerns that should occupy Indian grand strategy and foreign policy if we're looking forward?
So I think there'll be 5 major challenges coming up on the grand strategic space. They're already with us today, but I think if you were to go through every statement, every government document, and distill it into the core elements, I think there are really 5. The first, as I mentioned, is the primary need is to basically accelerate India's own development. And I'm thinking of this in the most comprehensive development, in the most comprehensive way possible,
Right.
not just incomes and all of that. And this is through sourcing investment and financing. It's through sourcing knowledge. It's through sourcing technology. It's through I think all of those things together. Market access overseas, I think, helps as well. So all of those things combined actually are integral to India's future development. And again, I mean this in the defense sector and the education sector and in every way. So that I think is priority number 1. Priority 2 is ensuring a peaceful periphery. And I think this will be a major very tricky challenge coming up in countries like Nepal, Bhutan, Sri Lanka, Maldives, Bangladesh, Myanmar. And these are countries where, India has friendly relations with all of them, but they're all democratizing and they're all undergoing their own political change. And these circumstances are leading to expressions of anti-Indianism at times, of bargaining with India. And you do actually now have in China a country that can play an alternative role. And so I think India will have to address this issue, and it's not going to be simple. Of how to preserve this peaceful periphery that it has, and extending into the Indian Ocean. A third is going to be preserving a balance of power in Asia, and this, particularly with China's rise, but also the emergence of others, not just India, Indonesia, other major economies now in the region. Preserving a stable balance of power is going to be occupied. This has been a preoccupation as far back as 1947, and in fact even before, where during World War II, quite unusually, you had the UK, US, India, and China working together to stem Japanese advancement. So this has been a game for now again the fault lines have changed. But this, again, will be a major priority going forward. The fourth is going to be insulating India from the instability to its west. Pakistan, obviously, where you have state-backed terrorism, Afghanistan, and West Asia as a whole, which is a region in significant churn, and where India has some very vital interests, including a large diaspora, energy imports, security interests as well. So insulating India from this is going to be a major challenge. This will require intervention, it will require containment, it will require a very diverse set of tools. The final challenge, I think, the fifth and final challenge, is going to be ensuring a place for India at the high table on global affairs. Not simply for the prestige value, but to ensure that India is in a position to shape outcomes that do not detrimentally affect it. And
at least define the rules of the game.
Define the rules of the game, right? And this will extend to, again, a wide range of areas, whether it's space, the future of outer space, climate change, future of internet governance, future of intellectual property and trade issues. So on all of those issues, and historically, India has been disadvantaged because after World War II, when the first round of rules were being determined, India was not yet independent, or it was just becoming independent. when there was another opportunity in the early 1990s, India was also in a very tricky situation. We had a balance of payments crisis. The economy was not doing very well. You'd had a number of insurgencies flaring. And so in neither of those two opportunities in the late 40s and the early 90s was India positioned to actually shape outcomes in its favor. We don't know what the next opportunity will be, but whenever that is, India needs to be appropriately placed. So I would say these are the 5 challenges that any government will face in the near-term future, which is accelerating prosperity, ensuring a peaceful periphery, ensuring a balance of power in the extended region, insulating ourselves from that instability to our west, and ensuring that we are that India is in an appropriate place on global governance.
Dhruva, thank you so much for coming on the Pragati Podcast. It was an absolute pleasure to have you here.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for staying with us till the end. The Pragati Podcast is now on Instagram. Follow us at Pragati Pod. That's PRAGATIPOD. If you listen to us on iTunes or Apple Podcasts, please leave us a rating and a review. It will mean a lot to us. Send us an email at haratepod@gmail.com with any questions and comments, and visit thinkpragati.com for your daily dose of brain fodder. You can subscribe to the Pragati Podcast on the all-new IVM podcast app or wherever you get your podcasts from. We are there everywhere.
Did you know that Parsis in Mumbai, instead of being left at the Tower of Silence after they die, are now cremated? And why? Because a cow fell sick in the early 1990s. Did you know that the smog in Delhi is caused by something that farmers in Punjab do and that there's no way to stop them? Did you know that there wasn't one gas tragedy in Bhopal, but 3? One of them was seen, but 2 were unseen. Did you know that many well-intentioned government policies hurt the people they're supposed to help? Why was demonetization a bad idea? How should GST have been implemented? Why are all our politicians so corrupt when not all of them are bad people? I'm Amit Verma, and in my weekly podcast, The Seen and the Unseen, I take a shot at answering all these questions and many more. I aim to go beyond the seen and show you the unseen effects of public policy and private action. I speak to experts on economics, political philosophy, cognitive neuroscience, and constitutional law so that the insights can blow not only my mind, but also yours. The Seen and the Unseen releases every Monday. So do check out the archives and follow the show at seenunseen.in. You can also subscribe to The Seen and the Unseen on whatever podcast app you happen to prefer.
Filter coffee is a fascinating beverage. You need to pick the right beans, blend them in the right proportion, roast them to perfection, and slow brew at the right temperature to get the perfect cup. Which is exactly like great conversations as well. You need to track down the most interesting minds, get them into their zone, and settle down for an unhurried, unscripted chat. And coffee for me is always, always, always best enjoyed with friends. I'm Karthik Nagarajan, and do share my table as I meet some of the most interesting people I know and sit them down for a strong cup of coffee and an even stronger conversation. Join me every Wednesday for a freshly brewed episode. This is not frappe. This is the Filter Coffee Podcast.